Wow, what a year for camera releases this is going to be in 2018. But today I want to talk to you about a camera that I last talked about half a year ago and which I came to love more and more, and this is the Fujifilm X-H1. Thank you so much for your positive feedback on my Fujifilm X-H1 review. I have to, dial down some of my criticisms from back then, because I criticized the way that Fuji implemented this switching between photo and video mode. And as many of you pointed me towards, there's this thing in the X-H1, which is the movie silent control, which kind of circumvents many of the problems I had back then, and I didn't realize it at the time. So it turns out that when you use the movie silent controls, they will stay in whatever settings you dial in, no matter what, even if you switch back to the photo modes on your dials on the camera. As soon as you use the video mode again, your movie silent controls will be enabled. So that means it's easier than I thought back then to switch back and forth from photo to video. It's still not as convenient as the custom dials on the Panasonic GH5, for example, or the Sony models, where you can just dial in your custom setting in one go. But it's getting the job done on the X-H1, and I like using it this way. I've set my X-H1 up this way, and it's convenient to use. Certainly if you have to switch constantly between, for example, slow motion modes or change your frame rates often, then you would still need to dive down into the deeper menus of the camera. But fortunately, those are easy to use on the Fuji. The second biggest issue I had with the camera in my review was the autofocus and its malfunctions, so to speak, from time to time, especially regarding that Fujifilm announced the X-H1 to be an upgrade to the autofocus mechanisms to their previous model, the X-T2. And this came as a huge surprise to me and to everyone, seeing that the X-H1 just didn't perform up to that level and was having some trouble finding the focus constantly. Sometimes it worked great, sometimes it had some trouble out of nowhere. And when you have an autofocus like that, it's extremely hard to make the decision to really use it in a production for a client. You would rather rely on manual focus, I feel, than to be always guessing about the autofocus. Does it perform today? Does it not? It's kind of a mood swing, if you will, and this is nothing I want in my camera. So I was excited to see the update, and I tried it out, and let's talk in detail about the results. Right off the bat, the firmware update improved the autofocus enormously. Compared to the slower and smoother settings, the default and especially the quicker focus adjustments are often too abrupt for my liking. Might sometimes draw the attention away from the subject just a little. I would opt for the smoother settings in general. After the initial tests, I found the sweet spot to be around the +4, -1 settings. A good mix of soft transitions and locking onto the subject. The newer 23mm lens did a really good job here, so I switched to the older 56 f1.2. This is a Fuji lens that's not really optimized for video, and it shows drastically here. At least in my previous sweet spot setup from before. It would just take a long time to find me even with the face recognition activated. There we go. Actually, once it locked on, it works all right. Even in the default settings, it just isn't reliable enough. And without a separate display or a flippy screen, it's nearly impossible to be sure about the focus. The quicker settings were hunting for focus a lot, even before I entered the frame, but the actual lock on was pretty good, even with the older lens. So it seems the lens itself is not necessarily the problem here. Still, I wouldn't use these settings, the shifting is just too distracting. So the bottom line with the autofocus after the update on the X-H1 for me is that it's still kind of a mixed bag, unfortunately. If you're using one of the newer lenses like the Fuji X-H1s, then you're a pretty happy camper, I would say, because they are quick to focus and a joy to use. But as soon as you try to use older lenses that were primarily built for photo back then, you will find yourself being a little bit disappointed, I guess. I had some very mixed results with the 56 1.2, for example, that would focus quite okay once it tracked you, but in all the other cases where it had to find you first and hunt around, sometimes it wouldn't even focus at all, even after 20 or 30 seconds, which is of course a total no-go if you have to rely on true autofocus for your one-man production, for example, like I'm doing it myself right here, filming with the 23 f2. I've seen some other people have good results even with the older lenses, such as Lee from Zed Pro Media, for example. And I just think those results with the older glass, with the older Fujifilm glass, they are dependent more or less on from where you're stepping into the frame, how quickly you're doing so, and what your internal settings in the body are. Which brings me to another little point of criticism here, because while I appreciate a lot that Fuji are offering us the options to adjust the tracking speed and the autofocus speed, in real life I have rarely found myself to be going deep into the menus to select the appropriate focusing mode for the current situation that I want to film right now. I mean, that's rather unrealistic. In general, yes, I would like to have all the options, but if that means that some of them are, hunting a lot and giving you this little focus stuttering, I would rather not have them and not use them ever. So with the X-H1, it's coming down to many situations where I found myself to be watching the autofocus really closely when I'm behind the camera. And when I'm in front of the camera, like right now, I have to just pray and trust. The forthcoming Fuji X-T3 has a much faster processor inside and is showing much improved autofocusing. So that's why I'm pretty hopeful for the future of the Fuji system, because the dream camera would probably be an X-H2 with all the Fuji goodness, improved autofocus system, and the IBIS on top of that. Yeah, I think I'm waiting for that one. All in all, I love using the X-H1 still. It's my go-to camera for work or personal use. It's such a joy to use. The ergonomics are wonderful. Well, the battery life sucks, but you can work around that by just bringing an extra battery or two. I didn't think this is too much of a problem. And it's nice to see a company like Fuji being so responsive and fix problems that are occurring so quickly and give us users those nice updates via firmware. I really appreciate that. and I think that's something that other manufacturers could copy here and there more often. That's it, my little update on the Fuji X-H1, a camera that's still certainly worth looking at in my opinion. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I see you at Photokina in a few days.